In the summer of 1456, all of Europe seemed to hold its breath. A single fortress stood between an empire that seemed impossible to stop and the heart of the continent. On one side was Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, leading tens of thousands of soldiers, heavy artillery, river fleets, and the full Ottoman war machine. On the other was a shattered city, a few thousand veterans, and crowds of peasants who had never held a weapon, yet believed they could stop the empire that had just crushed the greatest city of the East. What happened on those walls was not just a siege, it was a collision of faith, fear, desperation, and courage. Fire rising over the river, the thunder of cannons, and hand-to-hand battles fought in dust and broken stone. At first glance, it looked like an execution, a battle with only one possible outcome, until the impossible happened. A furious counterattack, wild, reckless, and completely unexpected, turned this siege into legend, and its echo still lives on today. Every day at noon, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, church bells ring, a quiet reminder of the day Belgrade stood firm. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it felt like the world had tilted off its axis. For centuries, the great city had been more than just a capital. It was a symbol, a wall of stone and faith that said to the West, the Ottomans can come this far and no further. When its walls finally broke under the cannons of Sultan Mehmed II, a question began to haunt Europe. What would fall next? News of the disaster rolled across the continent like a storm. In Italian ports, merchants whispered that the trade routes might change forever. In German taverns, soldiers talked about the Turkish thunder that had shattered Constantinople's defenses. In Rome, the Pope listened to reports of churches turned into mosques and knew that the frontier of the Christian world had just moved several hundred miles closer. But if Constantinople was gone, the geography of Europe remained the same. Between the Ottoman Empire and the rich plains of Central Europe stood one obvious target, a city at the meeting point of the Danube and the Sava rivers, a fortress called Belgrade. To Sultan Mehmed II, Belgrade was not just another castle on the map. It was the key to Hungary, and Hungary was the gateway to the heart of Europe. If Belgrade fell, the road toward Buda and Vienna would open. The young Sultan, already called the Conqueror, was not the kind of man who ignored doors like that. So he made it clear, Belgrade would be the next target. Orders spread out across his empire, calling for men, cannons, horses, river ships, and endless supplies. What had begun as a whisper on the frontier slowly took shape as a grand, carefully planned Ottoman campaign, one of the largest the Hungarian border had ever seen. In the Kingdom of Hungary, people understood this even more clearly. Hungary was ruled by a boy king, Ladislaus the Posthumous. The real strength of the kingdom lay not in the royal court, but in one man whose name still carried weight years after his greatest victories. John Hunyadi. He was a veteran of countless campaigns against the Ottomans, a commander who knew what it felt like to see Turkish banners moving like waves over the horizon. Hunyadi had seen the pattern. First, the Ottomans would focus on softening up a region, raiding, burning, probing its defenses. Then when they were sure of themselves, they would send the great army, infantry, cavalry, artillery, fleets of supply boats on the Danube. They had done it to Constantinople. He was sure they would try it again. This time he believed the target would be Belgrade. While noblemen argued in councils and diplomats traded letters, rumors drifted in from the south. Villages along the frontier reported Ottoman scouts. Traders spoke of new cannon being cast, of ships being prepared on the lower Danube. Slowly, the outline of a coming storm became impossible to ignore. In Rome, Pope Calixtus III tried to answer that storm with words and faith. He called for a new crusade, urging kings and peasants alike to defend Christendom. But unlike the time of the First Crusade, Europe was divided, tired, suspicious. Many rulers were more interested in their own neighbors than in a distant threat from the east. And yet, in all this uncertainty, one fact remained painfully simple. If Belgrade stood, Europe would have time to breathe. If Belgrade fell, no one could say where the Ottomans would stop. That is how a city at the edge of the map became the center of history. The decision to defend Belgrade did not begin in a royal palace. It began in the restless mind of John Hunyadi. Hunyadi understood that Hungary could not wait for a perfect army or for every noble to agree. The Ottomans would not pause their cannons until everyone in Europe felt ready. If Belgrade was going to hold, it needed men, food, weapons, and it needed them fast. First, he moved with what he still controlled, his own fortune and reputation. Hunyadi poured his wealth into the effort. He hired mercenaries, summoned veterans who had fought under him before, and sent letters across the kingdom calling his vassals to arms. He arranged for ships and boats to be gathered on the upper Danube, knowing that whoever controlled the river would control the lifeline of the siege. But warriors and weapons would not be enough. Far away from battlefields, in churches and village squares, another figure was at work, a small, intense friar named John of Capistrano. He was not a general. He carried no sword, yet his voice would summon an army. Capistrano traveled across Hungary and beyond, preaching with a kind of burning urgency that could not be ignored. He spoke of Constantinople's fall, of churches turned into stables, of crosses pulled down. He told peasants, craftsmen, and townfolk that the defense of Belgrade was not just Hungary's problem, it was everyone's. To many of them, he said something they rarely heard, that God could use their hands, their courage, no matter how poor or untrained they were. They came, not in perfect armor, not in shining ranks, but they came. Peasants with old spears, city militias with mismatched shields. Men who had never marched farther than the next market town found themselves walking toward a fortress they had only heard about in sermons. Some came out of faith, some out of fear, some out of anger at the stories from Constantinople. All of them walked into a storm they could not yet imagine. Inside Belgrade itself, the mood shifted. The city was not just a fortress, it was a living place, full of families, traders, craftsmen. As word spread that the Ottoman army was on the move, life changed. Stonecutters were ordered to repair and reinforce walls. Carpenters built platforms for artillery. Blacksmiths worked day and night, mending armor and forging arrowheads until their hands shook from exhaustion. Women and children carried stones, water, and bundles of arrows. Food was brought in and stored. Wells were checked and cleaned. The narrow streets grew more crowded with soldiers, pilgrims, and wagons loaded with grain and barrels. Every day, more men arrived to take their place on the walls. Every day, the shadow of the approaching army grew larger. By early summer, Belgrade was no longer just a fortress on a map. It was a statement. We will not step aside. Out on the river and in the countryside, Hunyadi made his own preparations. He knew better than anyone that Belgrade could not survive a long siege alone. He planned to bring his relief army as close as he could to help break the Ottoman grip when the time came. What he did not yet know was how soon that time would arrive. They saw the Ottomans before they heard them. From the watchtowers of Belgrade, sentries squinted into the shimmering heat of the plain. At first, it was just a smear of dust at the edge of the horizon. Then, slowly, shapes emerged. Long lines of men, horses, wagons, and artillery, moving with the steady rhythm of an army that had walked this road many times before. The banners came into focus next. Green standards with golden crescents, ranks of flags fluttering above the marching columns. Behind them rolled the great cannons that had broken the walls of Constantinople. Each one had its own team of oxen, engineers, and guards. They were not just weapons, they were symbols. They whispered one message: these walls will fall too. By land and by river, the Ottoman war machine closed its fist around Belgrade. On the Danube, Ottoman ships and rafts appeared, loaded with soldiers and supplies. They aimed to cut the city off from any help that might come from upstream. If the river could be controlled, Belgrade would be starved into surrender, even if its walls held. Inside the city, people pressed to the ramparts trying to see. Some made the sign of the cross. Others stared in silence, too stunned to pray. Children clung to their mothers' skirts as the ground began to faintly tremble under the weight of thousands of marching feet and rolling wheels. Then the sounds arrived, drums deep and steady, trumpets and pipes, the shouted commands of officers, the squeal of cart axles, and the whinny of horses. It did not sound like a single army. It sounded like a storm front made of iron and flesh. John Hunyadi was not in the city yet. His relief army was still on the move. For now, Belgrade's fate rested in the hands of its garrison and the crowds of volunteers within its walls. They got to work. Defenders dragged more stones and earth onto the walls, thickening the ramparts where they expected the heaviest fire. Artillery pieces were rolled into position. Crossbowmen and archers were assigned to towers. Priests moved along the parapets, offering blessings, hearing confessions, reminding men that courage did not mean the absence of fear. The first Ottoman move was not a charge. It was a ring. They spread around the city, digging trenches, building earthworks, setting up their own batteries. Siege engineers measured distances, marked firing lines, and selected positions for the big guns. Slave laborers carried logs and wicker to build protective screens. Within days, a second, hostile landscape had risen around Belgrade. Lines of dirt and wood, pointing inward like a crown of thorns. Then the bombardment began. At first, a single cannon shot. The deep boom rolled over the city, followed by a pause long enough for everyone to ask the same quiet question. Where did it hit? Then came another shot, and another. Soon the pauses disappeared. The air filled with the dull thunder of iron balls smashing into stone. Walls shuddered. Plaster rained from ceilings. In some houses, icons and paintings fell to the floor. On the ramparts, defenders learned the rhythm of the guns, counting the seconds between shots, trying to guess when and where the next impact would land. Every night, fires were put out, cracks were examined, and damage was repaired as best as it could be. Every day, the Ottoman guns roared again. The siege of Belgrade had truly begun. For Belgrade to survive, the defenders needed more than courage. They needed the river. As the Ottoman lines tightened on land, their ships on the Danube tried to complete the stranglehold. If they could block the river, Hunyadi's reinforcements and supplies would never reach the city. Belgrade would become a stone prison, slowly starving under its own dignity. Hunyadi understood this perfectly. When he finally reached the area with his own forces, he did not march straight for the land walls. He looked to the water, gathering every vessel he could. Warships, river boats, even converted barges. Hunyadi prepared for a desperate gamble. His plan was simple and nearly insane. He would attack the Ottoman river fleet head-on under the guns of their shore batteries and punch a hole in the blockade. The men who climbed onto those boats knew what they were sailing into. Many were peasants and volunteers, not trained Marines. They crossed themselves, gripped rough wooden oars and borrowed weapons, and listened to the priests blessing them as if they were already halfway to the next world. Then the boats pushed off. The battle that followed turned the Danube into a boiling line of chaos. Ottoman ships, better armed and more experienced on the water, moved to intercept. Arrows and bolts laced the air. Cannons fired from both river and shore, sending sprays of water and splinters into the sky. But numbers and discipline were not the only forces on the river that day. Desperation has a power of its own. Hunyadi's men rammed, boarded, and set fire to enemy vessels. They fought hand-to-hand on narrow decks slick with blood and river water. Smoke rolled low over the water, turning the battle into a confusion of shouting shadows and flashes of steel. From the walls of Belgrade, men and women watched as if witnessing the outcome of their own death sentence being written in real time. Slowly, impossibly, the Ottoman line began to break. Some of their ships burned. Others drifted, their crews dead or scattered. Openings appeared in the blockade like gaps in a net. Through those gaps, Hunyadi's battered but victorious flotilla forced its way toward Belgrade, towing supply boats behind it. When the surviving Christian ships finally reached the safety of the fortress, a roar went up from the walls that drowned out, for a moment, even the thunder of the Ottoman guns. Bread, grain, powder, and reinforcements poured into the city. Belgrade had bought itself something priceless: time. The Ottomans answered with fury. Their bombardment intensified. Stones that had held for centuries shattered under the constant iron rain. Craters appeared where smooth walls had once stood. Dust and smoke clung to the city like a second sky. Defenders wiped debris from their eyes and kept shooting, kept loading, kept praying. Then came the day when the guns were followed by something worse. After days of pounding the same sections of wall, the Ottomans launched a massive assault. Waves of infantry surged toward the breached and weakened points. Elite Janissaries, auxiliaries, and irregulars, climbing over rubble, ladders, and each other. Drums hammered a brutal rhythm. War cries rose in a dozen languages. On the walls, the defenders met them with everything they had: stones, arrows, boiling liquids, gunfire at point-blank range. Men grappled over broken battlements, slipping in blood. At some points, the Ottomans managed to gain a foothold, raising their banners over ruined towers. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the city had finally been cracked open. But Belgrade did not break. Not yet. Hunyadi threw himself and his men into the worst of the fighting. Capistrano, the old friar, moved through the chaos holding up a cross, calling men to stand their ground. The defenders counterattacked inside their own shattered defenses, turning collapsed walls into traps and death pits. By nightfall, much of the outer line of defense was ruined. The city was bruised, bleeding, and partially open to the enemy, but it was still alive, and that meant the story was not over. Belgrade's defenders had survived the storm, but they were standing on broken ground. The outer defenses were smashed, and parts of the city lay dangerously exposed. The Ottomans believed they were close to victory. They tightened their lines, prepared more assaults, and waited for Belgrade to finally collapse under exhaustion. Instead, something unexpected happened. On July 22, 1456, after days of bombardment and brutal fighting, John Hunyadi made a decision that only a man who had run out of safe options could make. He would not simply wait for the next Ottoman assault. He would attack first. At dawn, the air still heavy with dust and the sour smell of gunpowder, small groups of defenders began slipping out through breaches and postern gates. What looked like scattered skirmishes at first were part of a larger plan. Hunyadi wanted to disturb the Ottoman positions, test their reactions, and find weak points in their forward lines. But the fire he lit spread faster than anyone expected. Encouraged by early successes, more defenders joined the fight outside the walls. Volunteers who had come to Belgrade as pilgrims with weapons now found themselves charging enemy trenches. The old friar Capistrano, who had spent his life preaching in churches, ran toward the fighting carrying his cross, shouting for men to follow. They did. What had begun as a probing action turned into a full-scale sortie. Christian forces surged into the Ottoman siege works, attacking gun positions, camps, and trenches. They toppled ladders, burned equipment, and seized whatever weapons they could carry. The Ottomans, caught off guard by the intensity and size of the assault, struggled to respond in an orderly way. Their chain of command faltered in the smoke and confusion. Some units counterattacked fiercely, others fell back, unsure if this was a local clash or the beginning of a larger relief attack. Hunyadi saw the hesitation and did what good commanders do in those rare, precious moments. He pushed harder. He directed his men to concentrate on key positions, especially around the damaged sections of the walls and the areas where Ottoman troops were most tightly packed. Fighting turned into a chaotic swirl. Men who had been separated by stone and river for weeks were now face to face on open ground, close enough to see each other's fear. Some accounts say that at one point, as Christian soldiers pressed forward, parts of the Ottoman camp itself were overrun. Tents burned, supplies scattered, horses bolted. The illusion of an invincible, perfectly controlled army began to crack. Under this pressure, parts of the Ottoman line broke. Retreats turned into small panics. Small panics threatened to turn into something bigger. Sultan Mehmed II himself is said to have been wounded during the chaos, adding another shock to an already shuddering army. The very presence that had inspired his troops now became a reminder that even their conqueror could bleed. As the day wore on, it became clear. The siege was no longer a one-sided story of a fortress being slowly crushed. It had become a fight the Ottomans might actually lose. By evening, their grand army, the same kind of force that had taken Constantinople, began to pull back from Belgrade's ruined walls. Not in triumph, but in frustration, exhaustion, and fear of what might happen if they stayed one day longer. The unthinkable had occurred. Belgrade still stood, and the Ottoman Empire was the side walking away. Victory at Belgrade did not feel like a celebration. It felt like surviving a shipwreck. When the Ottoman army withdrew, they left behind a landscape of ruins and graves. The walls of Belgrade were jagged and broken. Houses lay crushed. Streets that had echoed with prayers and war cries now trembled under the wheels of carts, carrying the wounded and the dead. Smoke faded slowly from the sky. The Danube, which had boiled with ships in battle, flowed on as if nothing had happened. Inside the city, people tried to grasp what they had just done. They had stood against an empire that had taken Constantinople. They had watched its banners rise and then retreat. Men who had expected to die on the battlements found themselves alive, staring at their own hands as if they no longer recognized them. Women who had prepared to burn their homes rather than see them captured now stepped over rubble, searching for neighbors and family. Victory, however, had a cruel companion: disease. In the weeks that followed, plague and sickness swept through the crowded, exhausted survivors. The same conditions that made Belgrade defensible: cramped quarters, constant stress, limited fresh supplies, made it fertile ground for illness. Among those who fell sick was John Hunyadi himself, the man who had spent his life fighting the Ottomans, who had just won one of his greatest victories, did not live long to enjoy it. Hunyadi died not by sword or cannon, but by the invisible enemy that often follows war: infection and disease. His death cast a different kind of shadow over the triumph. For Hungary, it meant the loss of its most experienced commander at the very moment when his legend was sealed. For Belgrade, it meant the man most closely associated with its survival would never again walk its walls. And yet, the memory of what he had done refused to fade. Far beyond the Danube, the impact of Belgrade echoed. In Rome, Pope Calixtus III ordered that church bells be rung at noon each day to remind Christians to pray for those defending against the Ottomans. Over time, the story of why those bells rang blurred in many places, but the custom remained. Even today, in towns and cities across Europe and beyond, bells still ring at midday, a faint, living echo of the summer when Belgrade stood. Politically, the victory did not destroy the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed II continued to rule, to fight, to build. The Ottomans remained a powerful force for centuries, but Belgrade had shown something important: that the unstoppable tide could, under the right circumstances, be stopped, at least for a time. For Central Europe, that time mattered. It gave kingdoms room to adjust, to fortify, to negotiate, to prepare for whatever came next. For the people who had been there, the peasants who boarded burning boats, the craftsmen who patched broken walls, the friar who led men into battle with only a cross in his hands, the siege became a memory they carried quietly for the rest of their lives. Not a legend carved in marble, but something simpler, a time when they were terrified and still stood their ground. The siege of Belgrade in 1456 is often described in numbers. How many soldiers marched? How many cannons fired? How many days the fighting lasted? But behind those numbers are smaller truths, that sometimes history bends not just because of emperors and kings, but because a city refuses to open its gates. That sometimes the most important victories are the ones that do not change the map overnight. Only the belief that the map can never change. On the banks of the Danube, in that hot, smoky summer, a fortress held. An empire stepped back, and the world for a moment breathed differently.